Welcome to Be Emboldened's live stream. I'm so excited to have Jay, our guest, on here today. I'm Natasha, your host, board chair of Be Emboldened, and Jay is joining us on a special live stream about the enneagram, a very hot topic, and we're glad to have you, Jay.
Thank
Jay,
you.
welcome. Would you mind sharing with our audience, those of you who don't know you, because you haven't even been on the podcast yet? It is coming, but it's not even here yet. Would you mind sharing a little bit about who you are and how you got connected to Be Emboldened?
Yeah, so I got connected with Being Bolden because I was at Denver Seminary with Naomi and Michael, so I got to know them while I was there, and so I did an MDiv there in apologetics, ethics, and biblical studies, and then but before that, I worked in the Air Force as a behavioral scientist, and during that time, I got my master's in psychology and then taught at the Air Force Academy for 3 years. And then upon finishing seminary, I got accepted to a PhD program in social psychology at Baylor University, where I am right now, and I'm wrapping up. I'm trying to do the last little bits of my dissertation, and I'll hopefully be done this summer. And so that's what I've been working on. So my ministry and work that I do kind of focuses on the intersection of psychology and apologetics, and the enneagram is fits within that realm of personality on the psychology side, and um, the apologetics part is how it's being used by some people, or defending the use of it or not using it, and how it relates to Christian doctrine.
Yeah, awesome. And do I hear that you have a book coming out about this? Is that true?
Yep, it was supposed to be due at the end of last month, but dissertation stuff got in the way, so I had to push back a little bit. But hopefully, that I'll be done writing that soon. And yeah, it's a kind of book. It has three parts, main parts to it. So it's kind of like a theology of the enneagram, so kind of history about it and whether it should be used based on theological reasons. And then the second part is kind of a scientific look at it, looking at the claims that it makes and what's scientifically testable. And then the last part is setting all that aside and whether it's useful tool or not. And so that's kind of what I'm working on. It's kind of gonna probably end up being a critique because it's, which we'll talk about, isn't very reliable scientifically, but ultimately the way I view it is more of like an informed consent kind of thing, like a
Mm-hmm.
very long one. So if people are thinking about using it or are using it, is kind of getting a full picture of where it comes from, what it claims, what it doesn't claim,
Mm-hmm.
how it could or couldn't be used, and what are the potential downsides of it, so
Yeah.
people know if they decide to use it what they're getting into.
Yeah. So spoiler alert, you guys have already heard a little bit here, and the questions we're going to ask today are going to be kind of diving into all of that. So this is really cool, kind of sneak peek into inside this book, and in a way through getting to talk to you, its author, in advance. So that's pretty exciting. So thank you so much for
I think,
being on here.
yeah,
So we have some people joining us live today. So anyone who's watching, please add your questions to the chat. We would love to answer them live. And for any who are maybe watching a replay of this, put your questions in the comments and we would love to get to them. So we do have a few questions to get us started, and hopefully that will inspire some more questions as we go here. And so first question off the bat here is, why does the Enneagram look like a pentagram? Is there a connection to Satanism which is associated with the pentagram?
yeah, so that was I first had that thought when I first came across it too, and so it seemed a little jarring at first. It's like, oh wow, why would Christians use this? But then when I actually started reading it and looking into it, it has really nothing to do with the pentagram at all, and so that it's a completely different thing. It's just coincidence that it kind of looks similar at first glance, but when you really pay attention to the lines and the directions and what they're doing, it's very different. It's unrelated completely, and not to say it doesn't have other questionable things in the background, as far as like, so part of it being like developed through numerology and things like that, but it's not related to the pentagram or Satanism.
Okay, good to know. We can clear that up.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's great to know that you also had that first thought. Many people may also. I did. I know I did when I first saw it too. So thanks for clearing that up. You mentioned numerology, and that's actually our next question here. So numerology is often associated with the Enneagram. Can you explain what numerology is, and if it's antithetical or in opposition to a Christian worldview, or what it is?
And so uh, it's often used in, I guess, maybe a variety of ways, but just in a broad sense of which I'm using it as more of just the kind of idea that there's hidden secrets or meaning within numbers, or maybe even bigger than that. And I apologize if I'm not doing justice to it for those who are more into that specifically, for or against. But so specifically with the enneagram, for instance, the the thought is that the lines that connect the numbers. So if you look at the numbers, the 3, 6, and 9 are connected in a triangle, right? And those are separate, and the other numbers are all connected in a way. So if you divide each of those numbers by 1, you get a repeating string of those numbers. And so that's the order in which they're connected. And the idea is that there's some kind of hidden meaning within the numbers that allow that connection, and that reveals something about how people are and why we can know that it accurately describes people.
Interesting. So would you say theologically, like, is that one of those examples of things in nature or science that reflect God's order and design in the universe, or is it something that's not is not in alignment with a Christian worldview at all?
And so I think scripture is generally kind of silent on this. And so if something like that were to happen, you could say like, okay, maybe that's going on, but largely a lot of claims are like meaning things that have been found and hidden within numbers are all fairly debunked as being like coincidence or things like that. And so I would say like it's something that could be the case, hypothetically, and if it were, it wouldn't oppose scripture, and it could be a sign that of God's design. But to go out and be looking for it, like it's almost certainly not going to be true. It might be that sometimes things work out in certain ways that align with scripture and might seem like really creepy or eerily like accurate or representative in some way. So, for instance, John Frame is a theologian, and he's a well-respected theologian. I don't think anyone would call him a heretic or anything like that. And so, in his was it Life of the Christian Doctrine book, he has a lot of things in there which he happens to break down into kind of 3 categories, right? So he's talking about these things, in terms of 3s or 3 levels. And so it's like say, oh, well, that's because, it relates to the Trinity or something like that, but it's not really that way. It just happens to be that these categories or these things that he's talking about in these cases break up into 3 categories, whereas that's not the case with everything. So so I would say no, it doesn't directly conflict with scripture, but if God was really revealing things to us that way, it would probably be a lot more apparent and a lot more consistent for sure. There won't be so many exceptions to the rules where it's like that, well, the number didn't work out this time, but maybe it will again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind is I wonder what comes to my mind when I hear you talking about this in a very balanced way, which I appreciate, is that maybe it could be a distraction, if anything, that there's not a lot of support for really spending a lot of time figuring that kind of thing out.
Right. And it's kind of similar in a way to like if you've heard of anything like the Bible code things where they claim like there's hidden messages in the Bible where if you look at every 10th letter, it will spell out these codes or it's predicted certain things. But it's really what happens when you do things like that is you're getting, a million or thousands of different things that are revealed. And then you just get this small fraction of coincidences that happen to explain things or predict things before they happen, but that's not really the case, and that would change even depending on the translation used. So it's kind of similar with numerology. So it just wouldn't be a very fruitful way to try to learn about things in the real world or how God revealed them.
Wow. I mean, there's definitely a whole rabbit trail we could go down in that direction, but there's actually a question here that I think kind of relates to that. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but to kind of loop back to this whole idea of personality tests, which is what people often call the enneagram, is a personality test. Is there something to that? Let me read this question here so I don't get it wrong. But is there a connection between people's fascination with personality tests and the appeal of divination, for example, like tarot cards or horoscopes, maybe numerology or like the Bible code. In other words, are these tools like personality tests, divination, fulfilling our desire to discover special knowledge about ourselves and our world? Do you see any connections there when you think about like human behavior or like the nature of our human nature?
So personality tests, I guess, just because there's a lot there in that question. So sorry, I just want to make sure I'm thorough here. So a lot of people will say the Enneagram is not a personality test or not just a personality test.
Hmm.
And so they'll say it's more than that. But when scientists, so as personality scientists would study personality, everything that the Enneagram would claim or claims it makes about people are part of what's considered personality. So as personality scientists, we look at it personality in very broad terms, which includes everything that the Enneagram says, except maybe some spiritual things, which may or may not fall under traditional views of personality. And even like most or many of the Enneagram books will say the Enneagram of personality or refer to it as a personality test. And so I want to just make sure I'm covering both sides, say like it's not on the one side, people who are using it or into it will say it's not just a personality test, it's more than that.
Hmm.
So I want to make sure it's clear there. But at the same time, from the other side, is that still to say that is one thing, but everything that it does claim does fit under the umbrella of what we study as personality scientists. And so, as far as the next question, I don't know if there's like, I think what it comes down to is a, probably the strongest need or desire that people have is to know and to be known.
Hmm.
You see that a lot in different ways in psychological literature, and
Hmm.
we know that's a very strong appeal for people. And so, personality tests allow us to know and be known better, I think. And so that's where a bigger appeal that comes in, because if we know ourselves, we can better present ourselves to other people or match our own desires, or we can know other people better. And in fact, one of the Enneagram books is even claims that once you know a person's type, in some ways you might know them better than they know themselves. And so it really, I think the underlying drive behind it is relational. So I think it's probably positive reasons why people want to use it,
Hmm.
to enhance relationships and connections with other people, or even with God. And so
Hmm.
I think the drive and why people use it is probably correctly oriented.
Yeah.
Did that
Yeah,
answer the
that's
question? Sorry.
I think so. I mean, that I think that really sums up why there is such an appeal to the Enneagram is, and that statement that you said about if you know someone's type, you know them better than they know themselves is quite compelling. And we do have that desire to be known. And I think too of our audience specifically who may have experienced religious abuse and to the point of being in a control group where they may not actually know who they are because they've been told by someone else who to be or how to be or and if they come out of that high control group, it's a whole new world of discovery at 15, 25, 40, 55, even older, of figuring out who am I. So
Mhm.
the Enneagram or other personality tests, finding that knowledge is very compelling. um, and so we actually so that kind of leads to what the basic question then, is it reliable? So we have a question here, is the Enneagram reliable? How would you answer that, Jay?
Yeah. So uh, the short answer is not really, especially when you get into the details of it. But I think the broader question also is, how do we actually know that? And how do we test whether it's reliable? Because there's a lot
Mm,
of different ways we test reliability as scientists. And so one way would be what we call test retest reliability. And so that's to say, if you take the test at two different times, are you going to test the same way twice? And so with the most common tests that we use in psychology would be the big five, sometimes referred to as the NEO because of the first three, the neuroticism, um, extroversion, and openness were the first three used. So the five-factor model. So it's got five dimensions of personality that are used. And so on those dimensions, you will get a score that can range from, so sometimes it's given in percentile, so like 1 percentile to 100th percentile, and that kind of rates you against other people. And so your score will, of course, it's going to change a little over time, but it's not going to categorically change who you are, right? But with the Enneagram or even like the Myers-Briggs, when they categorize you into a specific box, then if you have a score that's somewhere in the middle percentile, you're going to likely shift a little bit in this normal variation from person to person based on our mood, based on just normal growth and development. You're going to change your type. And so that's what we see kind of driving pretty low reliability numbers with the Enneagram or any really personality test that categorizes people into distinct types to say you're this type but not that type, and making those clear distinctions. Whereas when things are rated on a kind of a continuum, you don't really have that issue. And so in terms of that level of reliability, it's not really reliable because people do change types, especially if people are kind of in the middle, they're going to go around back and forth. And then you would have like the next level, which would be the reliability of it actually describing people accurately, right? And so lots of different ways we test this, and we test like called internal reliability, or we use factor analysis or things like that. But again, what we find is a lot of the alleged attributes that go for each type aren't really well correlated with each other, or that maybe people are described by type, but they're not described like really well. Maybe like 1 or 2 points from the type describe someone really well, but not the rest of it. Or maybe they're described really well by multiple types, and so that's why you get a lot of issues with people typing themselves or being typed by test or in other people, is because there's so many different factors that the Enneagram is kind of trying to categorize people as. So they're trying to take a lot of attributes and put them together, but they have a lot of these attributes, but they might have a lot of these. And so that's where we get a lot of pretty low reliability between different raters or types and people who are categorized. And so that's another level. And then the last one would be the additional claims. So if you look at just the types themselves, like you would say, like probably people might be able to find a type or a couple types that describe them better than some types do, right? So I usually score as a 5, and I would say a 5 on the Enneagram probably describes me best, but 1 describes me pretty well too, and some of the others do, but some of the other types don't really describe me at all. So there's a kind of a little level of reliability there. But then when you get into like the wings and the triads and the different things, then that's, I would say, completely random. So for instance, as a 5, if you would say I'm a 5 and that's my type, I could only have a 4 wing or a 6. This is based on Enneagram theory, and it's like everyone teaches about the Enneagram with the wings. But really the next type that describes me best is a 1, which isn't connected to a 5 at all. So I would be a 5 with a 1 wing, but that doesn't even make sense. It's not even an option with the Enneagram. So once you start getting into those things, the directions of growth and stress, like those don't have any reliability. They've been tested to some degree a little bit, and they don't do very well at all there. They completely fail those tests.
Wow. So yeah, short answer is no. I am curious though. You talk about tests, and you really shared about the behavioral science rubric or criteria that of these other tests have or other personality tests have gone through. But what research has been done? So or how would someone find research studies on the Enneagram if they really wanted to look into it themselves? Of, well, what is the reliability? What tests have been done on the Enneagram? Where would people find those research studies that you mentioned on the Enneagram?
Yeah, so the best place to go in, and pretty much for any kind of academic research that you're looking for, would be to just look using Google Scholar. So not just Google, but Google Scholar. So it's going to look for academic sources for you. The problem is sometimes getting access to those. And so it can be a little difficult sometimes, but usually if you email authors and things, they'll share copies with you. But there was a recent review, so I think recent now, published in 2021, I think, that kind of categorizes a lot of this research. So that would be a place to kind of get an overview of a lot of it and what it does, a lot of the research, but a lot of the studies that have been done. So most of them are thesis or dissertation projects, so they haven't been put through peer review. The ones that have been peer reviewed and published in journals are pretty low quality. And I say that not like as being overly critical, but in the sense of like they're lower quality journals for one, but even like a lot of the mistakes you see in them wouldn't get accepted in higher quality journals. So for instance, one of them, the one that sticks out the most is they wanted to test whether the Enneagram helped people um, develop their identity better. And so they grouped people into a minimal Enneagram training and an intensive Enneagram training program. And so the thought was that the intensive one, people would grow more than the other one. Well, the results showed that they didn't. There was no difference. And so then that would be it in a normal journey. Say, okay, there's no difference. But then they looked at individual groups. So they had groups within groups at different training centers. They found one out of like 7 groups that did have change. And they didn't even compare it to the change in the other one. So it was just pre and post change. So for instance, if you have depression and you go see a therapist, to know if you got better, you have to compare pre and post, not just to yourself, but compared to other people, because over time you're probably going to get better if you do nothing. And so they did this. So they just did the pre and post. They didn't compare to how other groups changed to see if there was a bigger change in this group. And so 1 out of 7 improved. Then they reported that they supported their hypothesis when it really didn't when they looked at all of them together. So it's essentially like a random chance, right? If you flip a coin 100 times, usually it's going to wind up about 50-50, but there might be an occasional time where you get like 60-40. And so you can't just determine that it's a weighted coin because you just tried a whole bunch of times so you got the result you were looking for. So I would say use Google Scholar. You can email me if you want access to any articles or anything. Look for that Josh Hook review would be a good place to start. But the other thing I just mentioned real quick is all of the studies as well that I've come across, except one, all are done by people trying to promote the Enneagram or who are favorable towards it. And so there's only one that from the outset said that they're not trying to do that because, and this because of the way that they make their hypotheses. So they're all hypothesizing that they'll get basically results that show the Enneagram is accurate or reliable or helpful. And then they end up usually not finding that, or they get mixed results, which in theory in science, it shouldn't matter if you're for or against something, but in practice, it does end up making a difference. And so it's not just me being critical. These are from the articles of people who are actually using it and trying to promote it and find evidence that it works.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, those are all great practices to think critically about something, of who it's peer reviewed by and what the sources are and what the hypothesis looks like. And is someone doing the research that may have a confirmation bias? So those are all really great things to think through as you're researching or learning about anything. It just came to mind to me though, like that can be a pretty high bar for someone versus picking up just a book off the shelf that looks enticing and tells them maybe things about the Enneagram and is an easily digestible way to understand it. Is that maybe why you're writing this book, Jay, to kind of help give people another perspective that's not represented yet?
Yeah, that's for sure. That's a big part of it, because if you go on like the Enneagram Institute's website or Jerome Wagner's website, who has a version of the Enneagram called the WEPS, the Wagner Enneagram Personality something. So these sites will say the Enneagram's been scientifically validated, and then they'll even say here's where that's been done. But then when you actually read through the studies, you find over and over again it's like, well, we had mixed results, or this didn't match our hypothesis, but this did. And so, or you get a lot of things that are questionable research practices. So like the Enneagram Institute that's from Rizzo and Hudson, which is probably the most popular version of the Enneagram. So the study that they say scientifically validated their hypothesis was a dissertation project from someone that they worked with on it, and you get things in there that are questionable at best. So when they're looking at some of the questions that are used to determine a type, some of them, when they did the statistical analysis, matched with the wrong type. So instead of reporting and saying, okay, this question essentially showed that this type doesn't work like we think it does. They just move the question to the other type and then say, okay, well, now it looks like it works. And so, that's, again, I don't think that was done with malintent, but with the assumption that without really people doing this without fully understanding the implications of what they're doing or the statistical methods that they're using, and they're just kind of looking to say, okay, well, this matches this, so let's just move it there because now we can use this as a reliable tool. And that's not really what's going on. What happened was that they thought that, I think it was in this instance, a type 4 was like this, but their research showed that type 6s are like that. And so they just said, okay, this is part of type 6 and not part of type 4, without changing the description of what the types are. They just changed this question on their test.
Wow. Wow. That's a little unnerving, honestly, to hear that kind of quality of research is labeled as scientifically viable. So,
but I would say, in their defense, this isn't mostly scientists who are doing this.
yeah.
The people promoting and writing about the enneagram, most of them are theologians or have kind of minimal kind of training in even in theology. So a lot of them are, and almost none of them, there's only a couple of them that have actual training in psychometric properties or statistical analysis or psychology or anything like that, where they could actually understand these tests. And so from their perspective, I would get why they would think that this is okay or why it's showing it's scientifically valid, but that's because they don't understand that researching and what it means when you have a Cronbach's alpha of 0.9 versus 0.5. Like that, those are things that you have to kind of learn and know through training.
Yeah. Wow. So I think the next question, and we got here, I think ties into that well, is with people who are, as you described, maybe not scientists or maybe not even theologically trained, who are talking about this, doing research on it, promoting it. That leads to, I mean, there's clearly a lot of people who want to see this done or see the good in it or see the benefit or the value in it. But the question we have here is, has anyone been harmed by the Enneagram?
Yeah. So unfortunately, you don't hear a lot about that. And when I first heard about the Enneagram and started doing some research in it, my wife and I were talking about it, having a conversation, and she actually went to a conference and she came back, and on the shuttle ride back to her car to the parking lot, she overheard a couple of women talking. They just came back from an Enneagram conference, and one of them was talking and saying how now she's wondering if she should stay married to her husband, and because of learning about the Enneagram and how the types weren't compatible. And it was, we don't know what happened. This is a conversation that she overheard. And so, I was assuming, okay, that's probably extremely rare and probably the worst case that we'll ever hear. But when I was working on an article for Christianity Today on it, I was connected with someone who had an even worse experience where her husband got into the Enneagram and using it, and determined because of it that their types weren't compatible, and so did get a divorce from her after a 22-year marriage. And there's other things going on, but he flat out said, if you want to blame something, blame the Enneagram. And I've heard other stories of people who have had relationships ended for it, or who weren't hired because of it, or were stereotyped, or so kind of in a not so positive way. Like there's one thing like, ha ha ha, like you said that because you're in a 6 or whatever, right? Things like that, having fun. But in the sense where like you're only thinking that way because you're a 2 or whatever, and so you're wrong. You just don't see it because you're 2, and kind of being condescended towards. But unfortunately, when people say that's not why, or they try to articulate that it's the Enneagram doesn't describe them well, they're either ostracized for it, or sometimes they don't even feel safe to do it because everyone is already so much on the bandwagon for the Enneagram, at least in some circles. It's not the case for everyone, and so then they don't have a voice. And so I've had a lot of people reach out to me and say like they're glad that I've written on it, because they felt like now they have someone they can talk to about it, or that they're happy to know that other people have also had negative experiences, because we don't often hear about that with people who are promoting it.
Yeah. Wow. What about within the church specifically, are you aware of cases where maybe it's being used in the church in a harmful way?
Yeah, there are lots of churches I know using it. I've heard of people not being hired at the church because they wouldn't take an
Mm.
enneagram test, or they weren't the right type.
Wow.
Ironically, actually, I started doing some research in the enneagram before moving here. So this is 2019, and that's when I first wrote a blog article on it. And so I thought that would kind of be the end of it. And so shortly after we moved, we found a church here, and we found out that just before we got there, that our church that we started going to was using it, and they quit using it. And the reason they quit, completely unrelated to anything I wrote about, though, was because the pastor noticed that basically people were using it as a tool to discriminate or stereotype each other. And it actually wasn't facilitating more connection and growth and better conversations.
Wow. Wow. I'm first of all, that's awful to hear. And second of all, I'm very grateful for the leadership seeing that and doing something about it. And I'm sure that was probably humbling for them to have to be like, never mind, we thought this was a good thing. We were promoting this and now we're gonna have to take that back.
Yeah,
So I mean, it sounds like that, was hopefully handled well, but it could be so easy for it not to be, right? For a church to be like not being humble enough to backtrack or to see the problem in it and just keep using it or keep promoting it.
right. Because a lot of churches get really invested with it, with
Yeah.
using it for their staff, or they're teaching seminars on it, or the pastors are going to conferences where they're getting trained, and they're spending thousands of dollars to do this, to get a
Hmm.
certification as an Enneagram expert, or whatever. And so they're putting a lot, investing a lot in it. So it's really hard then at that point when some
Yeah.
personally, or your church or organization has put thousands of dollars into it, or even tens of thousands of dollars, to say, okay, this isn't very good, we should walk away.
Yeah. Wow. Are there other cases that you're aware of people in the church misusing it, or maybe how I don't know. Actually, maybe a better question is, how would you approach a church if your church is using the Enneagram and you don't think they should be using it? How would you recommend someone approach church leadership with those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same way that you would with any concerns you have with the church. So a lot of it depends on whether you're going to be heard or respected based on your relationship and how well you know the people, but also the degree to which you're willing to listen. So if maybe you don't have the relationship, you're new to a church or whatever, if you just say, hey, like, I have concerns, here's what they are, but I would love to chat about it, and being willing to actually listen and hear their other side, and um, not just be a critic, but also be willing to have a conversation together, and listen in the same way that you expect to be listened to.
Hmm.
I think that would be kind of the way to go about it.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Wow. Well, Jay, this is great. I think this is actually a great time to take a minute here and just remind people that if you've been hurt by the church, by a high control a religious group, the reason we exist is to help you where you're at. And one of the opportunities that we have to do that is we have a very special experience coming up in June for people, and registration closes on May 26th. So if you are interested in getting more information about really getting unstuck from your healing journey in from a religious abusive experience, we encourage you to sign up for that and take a look at the getaway. So there's a link in the chat to check out the getaway and find out all the information about it. It's a beautiful ranch in Colorado. It's going to be a gorgeous time of year, amazing food, amazing quiet time and experience to connect with people in a very safe environment, and get some really great information about how to get unstuck in your journey of healing from religious abuse. So back to these questions, Jay. We're curious here. We kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, so I'm curious if you have anything else to add. But someone did ask, how does the Enneagram compare to horoscopes? And I think something that you mentioned was, you resonated as a 5, but also as a 1, and kind of saw bits and pieces and other things. And so is that kind of related to a horoscope being kind of a general, just assumption, so I don't, is there a comparison or any connection between the Enneagram and horoscopes?
So there was an interesting study, or at least I think it was interesting, back in the 40s. I think it was 49. So this was on horoscopes actually, and so what the Bertrand Forer was a psychologist who tested this. So he gave his students a personality test one week, and then the next week he came into class and then gave them the results and had them rate how accurate the results were. And the results, I think it was 10 kind of general statements about people that he got from a horoscope book or something. And so from these 10 general statements, it's something like you're outgoing, but you like to stay in and also have quiet time. So things like that, which is called a double-barreled statement. So this kind of covers both ends of the spectrum. So these kind of double-barreled statements are very broad statements that just describe everyone or most people. And so these 10 statements was the results of their personality tests. And out of the 30 students, almost every one of them except one rated the test as accurate, more accurate than not. And then most of them rated extremely accurate. And then when he revealed that they all got the same thing, then they laughed and thought it was funny. But that's where we get what we call, sometimes called the Forer effect, but most often called the Barnum effect, where it's just these broad general statements about people that we feel are uncannily descriptive of us or eerily descriptive of us. And so that was tested with horoscopes, and it's been tested over and over again with horoscopes, and we see that kind of going on. And so we see similar things with a lot of the statements with the enneagram, where I think the enneagram is maybe a little more precise, but not a whole lot. So there's that kind of connection or similarity in terms of like why it seems so accurate. There have been some people who have tried to convert the horoscopes into enneagram types and say like, here's these types, because there's 12 for horoscopes, 12 personality types, and 9 for the enneagram. So they kind of try to mix to say like these ones are one for one, but then these other ones split, and things like that. So there's been some to do that. So there's not like a direct connection. It wasn't directly derived. The enneagram wasn't directly derived from horoscopes or anything, but there are some similarities in the terms of like why they work and what claims they do make about people.
Yeah, fascinating. um this question might I'm just thinking through, you've already answered the question about whether or not the Enneagram is reliable. We haven't even really dived in at all to where the Enneagram comes from. And I think you talk about that more in the podcast. I'm not sure if you talk about that in the book that you have coming out here soon, but um, I personally have heard people kind of write off the origin of the Enneagram and dismiss it, sort of like, oh, we don't really know, and so it doesn't really matter. So, how would you respond to someone who writes off the background of the Enneagram, saying it shouldn't impact how we use it because the background is unclear, unknown? How would you respond to someone who says to say that?
So there, this is I would say a little more complicated than people often talk about it. And so I would say on the one hand, like where it came from doesn't matter if it's accurate. So I'll give the example of like some guy is worshiping Satan, and Satan gives him the um, treatment for cancer to cure all cancer, and he got that because Satan revealed that to him. Almost no one would say, okay, I'm not going to use that cure, or I'm going to discourage other people from using that because you got it from Satan, right? So, because ultimately that information that was revealed was true information about reality. So, I would say using the Enneagram, if it really does describe people accurately, it doesn't really matter where it came from. I would say that doesn't mean go out and look at demonic or evil forces or spirit to try to get information, but if that's been revealed through someone else and then now is part of kind of our cultural knowledge, then I would say it's free game to use. Just don't go looking from those sources. So I'd say that that one way, if it really does describe people, even if it has questionable or uncertain origins, if it's accurate, then it's a tool I think we should use because it describes reality. Because the opposite would be if the Enneagram says one thing and that's true, if you're not using it or you're opposing it, that means you're fighting against what is true, which doesn't make sense. As Christians, we shouldn't be fighting truth. That's why a lot of where I focus and try to come at this perspective of the Enneagram is scientifically to see, does it
Mm.
make claims that are true about people, and it really doesn't. Like some it makes that are true, but it also makes false claims, and so it's when you're just rolling the dice with true and false claims, that's not something that should be used or tested. So on the one hand, I say because of the origins and the questionable ways in which it was developed or created, doesn't matter. So if it's accurate, but it's not, so it's kind of irrelevant. But on the other hand, I say like the origins, um, a lot of people have false information there about how it was created and what was going on, and so it's not ancient. There's video of Claudio Naranjo admitting that they made up this ancient origin story of it, and that he used a combination of observation and automatic writing. So the
Mm.
automatic writing would be where he kind of opens himself up in a trance state so that a spirit can write through him. Presumably, that would be, as the Christians would say, a demonic spirit of some sort, and that's what revealed the information. Um, those who use the Enneagram say, well, Naranjo was talking about automatic writing in the sense of more of just connecting with his own self-conscious, not a spirit, and so it
Mm.
wasn't evil, or that he was prone to exaggeration and things like that. So he probably didn't do that because he didn't reveal that information until 30 years or something after he's been using it. So that would be the rebuttal. But the context in which he describes it seems like he's admitting that he did get it from some sort of spirit. But then, there's that maybe a level of uncertainty. But then I would say, again, from more the science perspective, even if you thought he was communicating with a spirit of some sort, like people do when they're using a Ouija board. We actually have scientific evidence where people have tested actually use a Ouija board, and we know that it's really actually people are unconsciously moving it themselves, and that can be influenced. They're just not aware of it. So it's called the ideomotor effect. And so it's probably not even if he thought he was getting it from a higher spirit, he probably really wasn't. And so
Mm.
again, probably doesn't have demonic origins, even if the people, or spiritual origins, even I would say, even if the people who created it thought it did come from a higher spiritual source. But it's also ultimately not accurate. So it always comes back to that for me. Like, is it accurate?
Mm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So the linchpin seems to be that those scientific research studies that are in existence but are not, maybe well done, or they may be low quality, or the mixed results. Like that's really where the deal breaker is for you as a behavioral scientist, understanding this and researching this. Like that's where it kind of falls apart.
Right. Yeah. And that's, yeah, essentially the linchpin is the accuracy. And I would say real quick that one of the big responses people say to me is that it's not a scientific tool, and so you can't test it scientifically. And so I would say, okay,
Mm.
that's fair enough if that's the case, but you can't just claim it's not a scientific tool and so that it can't be scientifically critiqued, because it does make scientifically testable claims. So when it says, type 3 is X, Y, and Z, those are scientifically testable claims. And so
Mm.
pretty much every claim that the Enneagram makes is scientifically testable. So it is a scientifically testable tool. And so anyone who claims otherwise is either probably not being intentionally deceptive, but probably just doesn't understand the research and how scientists actually test personality.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but I've never heard of the big five before, this conversation. Like I've heard of Myers-Briggs and DISC and, the Enneagram, but like these what sounds like scientifically proven personality, determining tests, the average person, unless you're in behavioral science or psychologist, like probably doesn't know. And so that's where it gets really tricky, right? Whereas like people are like, but this is true for me. And so I'm going to believe it.
Right. Yeah. And that's a hard thing. Like, there's so much information in this world. Like, we can't know it all. We can't be expected to. And so, we do what works for us, um, and that's expected and normal. But I would say what we should be open to always is that when we do come across information that conflicts with what seems to work or what seems accurate for us or true for us, is that we're open to listening to that information and learning more about it so that we can have a more accurate view of reality.
Hmm. Wow. Jay, I cannot have said it better than that. And I think that's kind of the idea I'd love for us to close on, is anything that you're looking into, to take that lens with it, of to be open to learn about it, to look into the scientific research that's been done, to ask questions, not just take information blindly, and really discern if that information is accurate. Has it been done well, or is it just being put out there and labeled with words to make it sound like it's scientifically proven, when is it or not? And there are ways to know. I think that's the most encouraging thing, Jay, is that there are ways to know and to find out what is true and what is not, what is scientifically proven and what is not.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. For all of our listeners, anyone who's watching, we would really love for you to share and subscribe. If you have enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please share, please like, please comment, and that helps us get the word out there to other people who can be benefited and helped by this information. So Jay, thank you so much for taking the time. Make sure you follow the Reclamation Podcast to hear this episode that's going to come out between Jay and Naomi about the Enneagram. You won't want to miss it. And Jay, we look forward to hearing more about that book when it comes out.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.